Hi, my name is Juliana Sly, and I'm a member of the Atlassian public sector team. Today, we're going to talk about remote work. 2020 was an unprecedented year, and by all marks, 2021 is continuing the trend. And it seems that everyone, personally and professionally, has learned the art of the pivot. One of the biggest pivots, though, has come for the government workforce, which went from an in-office environment with an in-person culture and dynamic that has been firmly rooted for decades to a work-from-home environment almost overnight. There was no mechanism set up for many of these agencies to shift their work teams to work from home. Many agencies lack the technology, the processes, and even the cultural capability to do that. And in some states, we had government workers literally carrying their tower systems home from them. Well, it's time to take a look back and see how we did. Well, the good news is that we are far more agile than we think. In a survey of remote government workers last fall, agencies felt that they saw no dip in productivity. In fact, many have even gone up. Once we have a handle on this pandemic and can open up offices full time again, in fact, many government agencies expect to retain some level of telework status. We're looking at about 50% of state employees who expect to retain a level of telework status and north of 70% of federal executives. But remote work in government is not without its challenges. Working remotely means navigating different schedules that are often asynchronous and the loss of water cooler conversations. And we're going to talk a little bit today about what that means for government agencies. In many ways, it requires finding new ways to interact with colleagues and get work done. But more importantly, it shifts the focus of getting work done from an organization level all the way down to the individual employee level. Because as you can see on the screen, what might work for some employees most definitely doesn't work for others. So yes, remote work is here to stay, but there are lessons that we can learn and improvements that can be made. One of the improvements is going to be around information and workflows. In rather significant ways, information and workflows were impacted over the course of the last year. Almost 90% of employees identified that they had trouble accessing project-related information and tools, and almost 50% said they had difficulty getting what they needed from coworkers. Over 40% felt that they had limited communication technology options and difficulty completing manual and offline processes. So what do agency teams need to do to succeed? Well, for remote work to work, agencies need to be able to mobilize the power of their teams to manage their projects and programs and drive outcomes. It comes down to giving employees simple, intuitive, and easy ways to see, share, and track their ideas, tasks, and outcomes. In many cases, it's a combination of tooling and culture. Technology needs to be the enabler here and not the barrier. What we're going to hear today is that the agencies that often persevered during these challenges and made the pivot successfully often had technology tool sets that easily adapted to government culture and workflows and provided a single source of truth for all work across 4 key areas: coordination, clarity, collaboration, and connection. And for these agencies, they often found that the tool sets that they had employed that delivered these 4 benefits also had added automation features that eliminated redundancy and fueled empowerment. And the result, and you'll hear a little bit more about this today, is that they actually supercharged their teams who became more capable of actually achieving more work in a remote environment than they did in an in-person environment. So, like Winston Churchill and countless others said, never waste a good crisis. We find that the pandemic forced adoption of remote work and provided the opportunity to break through some of the inherent challenges government teams face in their ability to work faster and meet evolving demands. Many remote government teams found that it was much easier than they thought it would be to make this pivot. They just needed to leverage the tools that their agencies had in place and supported them. Now, the real win-win here is that the tools and technologies that supported the remote workforce pivot for many government agencies actually increased overall agency efficiency, and they'll be able to take that back into the in-person workplace. And so the Band-Aid is off. The investments have largely been made in systems and networks and security. It's time to refine and improve the processes and the tool sets, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Some have said there's an opportunity to take a page out of the Agile playbook and continue to improve frameworks and tools. The key is, though, to do it thoughtfully, do it intentionally, and account for different work styles. There's also a need to do it quickly, and with that quickness comes iteration. And so you have that methodology that's borrowed from DevSecOps where you fail forward and adjust and try something new. So now let's turn to our panel for their lessons learned and advice on how to thoughtfully support more collaborative, transparent, and productive remote work. We are thrilled to have these four panelists with us today, and I'm going to start with Andrew. Andrew Politi is an expert Agilist and product development specialist. He has introduced Agile techniques to garage-based startups, large multinational organizations, and federal agencies. Currently a principal consultant at Enterprise Knowledge, Andrew provides Agile coaching for the Office of the CTO and the Office of Digital Infrastructure Technologies at the General Services Administration. Nikki Bellington is the head of talent programs, remote and onboarding at Atlassian. She is part of a large cross-functional effort responsible for creating, scaling, and growing Atlassian's distributed work strategy and approach, which include reinventing our talent programs, such as onboarding, to be successful in a remote environment. Urvashi Dhawan Biswal is the Senior Director of the Digital Design Branch at Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, where she is leading the design of better digital government services for Canadian business using agile and people-centered methods. Prior to joining ISET in 2019, Urvashi was the director of the Innovation Lab at Employment and Social Development Canada, where she developed innovative solutions to complex policy, program, and service delivery challenges. And now I'd like to turn things over to our panel and begin to discuss the lessons that we've learned in the remote work pivot. Hi, team. I'm so glad that we could be here today. Thank you so much in advance for all of your time and your insight. Let's go ahead and start, Andrew, with you. Looking back through that transition to moving teams to remote work inside of the GSA, how would you rate the experience? Was it successful?
Great question. We were so much more successful, I think, than anyone would have guessed. We had a lot of things in place, as you just mentioned, about having tools kind of in the very early stages, but that put us ahead of the game. I think a lot of people have this sense, this wrong sense of the way that federal governments operate, and they're not able to pivot quickly. That's exactly what we found at GSA. We had some great support, obviously from GSA IT, but down through all the business lines. Everyone really pivoted very well. We had a great experience. And a lot of the tools that we had in place, we were able to ramp up very quickly. So overall, actually, we had a pretty good experience. I recognize that's not the case everywhere, but at GSA, it actually worked out pretty well for us.
Oh, that's fantastic. And Urvashi, the same question, but a slightly different slant. Was it easier or harder than your teams thought it would be?
A really good question, Jules. For us, it was actually, I agree with Andrew. We were very well set up to make this transition. We hadn't used some of these tools. And what I found really fascinating was how the Agile team self-organized, looked at all the tools and made that transition. It was not that easy, but it was quick. So we pivoted. As you know, we do user-centered research and we talk to businesses, we do interviews, and we had to quickly find a way to do that online and make that switch and learn and continuously grow. So it has been a very fulfilling experience from that point of view.
That's fantastic. And Nikki, Atlassian is a company that pretty much defines the concept of remote work, but I'm sure there were still some things you learned along the way. What were some of those things?
Yes. So Atlassian makes, collaboration software for teams. So I think we were a step ahead or fortunate to have that set up before the pandemic, before we all moved. But we had to move 5,000 plus people to a remote environment in a matter of days. And so we still had a lot of lessons learned. And I think the biggest one was really some of the stuff that you mentioned in your slides, communication and collaboration, right? What would happen normally of just walking by someone's desk, asking some questions or chatting, now took intentionality. It took organizing and setting up a meeting or pinging on Slack or making sure the right people were together to have a discussion. And so we are still learning. We're still figuring things out. We're still iterating on what works best for our teams and best for us as a company.
Mm-hmm. And for the rest of the panelists as well, when you think about it from a government environment, what were some of your lessons learned?
So I can go and I can share some of our experiences. One of the things that really came out of this pandemic and working remotely from home is the power of leadership. So, as a leader, actually, it goes back to Jules, your point about connection. I think when we are in person in the office, we didn't have to spend as much time managing people, and especially managing people from that emotional point of view. And I think as leaders, we had to demonstrate the talk. So if we don't walk the talk, we can say may have work-life balance, but if we didn't demonstrate it in our actions, it was not a message that was going through. So what I learned really is we were fortunate to be in a department where our deputies were really walking the talk. And me, myself as a senior leader, I worked 4 months from India, and I actually really showed them that this is possible. So there are a lot of advantages. And I think the other thing that we really must understand with this pandemic that it brought about is it's the culture. So how do you create a safe space for your employees to have these conversations, have these difficult conversations, because that really raises your productivity. If we can manage that mental health as well as work-life balance, it's a win-win combination. So there are a lot of positives, but there are a lot of areas that it has demonstrated that we must be leaders first. And that's the job that really we are very passionate about.
Yeah, I agree with that so much. What you're saying about leadership, I think, is one of the key takeaways we found here. I think leaders with high EQ is what's important. We've had leaders who, sometimes they in person they have a very traditional style. What we found is our leaders are adaptable and our teams are adaptable. And you need to have a leader with high EQ to figure out what the right balance is there. For some people, it's work-life balance. For some, like myself, it's more work-life integration. But you need to have a leader who understands kind of what that difference is and what the different styles are. We found that we're actually pretty good at it. If we're looking for a lesson to take away, we found that we can trust our individuals on the team. We can trust our leaders to manage appropriately. So it was a very pleasant experience, I think, for a lot of folks. It's not to say, some folks will need more attention. They'll need more attention from their leaders. But overall, it was a pretty good experience. And that was, I think, a very positive lesson learned here.
So remote work in many ways starts with leadership and how leadership approaches and understands the unique needs of remote work. It's not necessarily that you're just now working from home. It is truly a shift to make sure that you've got the right connections and that you've got the right technology that supports a wider range of needs beyond just the functional job itself.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think leaders have figured out is some people work better on one-to-one interactions like this on camera. Some work in a tool like a Trello or Slack or whatever it happens to be. We've got some leaders who, even on the worker side, I know that I can talk to certain of the executives. They really like using chat, so that's how I come at them. Just having everyone have that understanding of how other people work is really important. I think we're all more aware of that than we used to be.
And I do want to add one more thing. One of the things I found fascinating is that as the pandemic hit, the deputies, like these are the senior most people in our department, starting having town halls. So the technology enabled a town hall with 5,000 people every few months. That is something that never took place prior to pandemic. What a wonderful way to move forward. Like that connection with your management is so empowering for all employees. And we should not let go of that once we come out of this pandemic and go back our previous ways of doing things. That was a huge message that came out, that you can connect with all your people and you don't need to rent spaces and take the expenses, but it's doable. So.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I'm hearing a little bit of what we heard in some of the surveys as well, which is for agencies who had the technology foundation in place, they were able to actually find whole new ways of working that were more efficient and more inclusive and yielded greater productivity. But let's click on that technology component for a moment, right? So what makes an effective remote tool? Is it just enough for it to be cloud-based? Or is there something else that needs to happen in order for a piece of technology to really fuel remote work environments? And Nikki, I'd like to turn to you to begin to answer that. And then I encourage the panel to sort of chime in with their perspectives as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, Jules, because I think sometimes we can over rotate for like a tool solves all of our problems. But I think it's a good question because kind of going back, it has to be intentional, right? And so I think we use a variety of different tools to do different things, right? And so one of the things that we're really trying to fine tune is synchronous versus asynchronous communication through our tooling. So many people might be aware of Slack or a similar tool like Microsoft Teams, where we're communicating synchronously. But we also need to have tools that allow us to communicate asynchronously. So for us, that's tools like Confluence or Trello or Jira, as well as tools like Mural. Mural is a collaborative tool where you can connect and collaborate together online, which is a new skill for a lot of people, right? Going back to, it's a lot easier to jump into a conference room and draw on a whiteboard, right? And so I think what we're figuring out is you can over rotate on tools. Like for example, you don't want people online all the time answering Slack messages, right? And so how do we use the tools right, but then also create the boundaries around them? I think that's what we're still fine tuning and trying to figure out.
Yeah, Nikki, and I completely agree with that in terms of, the tool selection, right? I think there are a lot of organizations who will just throw every tool against the wall and see what sticks. That's not necessarily the right approach. You can get into analysis by, paralysis by analysis, but what I suggest there for teams listening is pick one, maybe two, and then run with those and see what happens. Don't spend months trying to evaluate. Just kind of, start using something. The other piece I wanted to kind of jump on what you just said about synchronous versus asynchronous. I think the key there is to establish norms, because I'm not sure I'm in complete agreement with you. I think that something like Slack can be seen as both synchronous and asynchronous. I don't know that we should put a label on any given tool. For example, on our teams, we use Trello, we use Mural, and we use Slack. So what we've done is we came together, at least on our CTO team, we came together and established certain norms around what the expected use of each was going to be. Is it, when do I expect a return a message? Is it 15 minutes to 2 hours? Is it, by the end of the week for emails, what we said. So what we did was we essentially came up with a grid, and we sat down as a team. We figured out what are our norms going to be around these tools. So I think that the key to being synchronous or asynchronous in your communication is just having a mutual common understanding, and that gets back to Agile values. If everyone is on the same page, if everyone has this common agreement as to what the tool is for and when I should use it, you're gonna have a lot better time adopting these tools. It helps to have a narrow set to choose from, but then agreeing how to work with it, I think is the next important step.
I love that, like putting out your team norms and figuring out what your ground rules are. One thing that we did kind of to extend that is also personal preference, right? So me as a person, right? What are the constraints that I have in my personal life? What are my preferences in communicating? Am I a morning person? Am I an evening person? And so, one of the tools that I believe we can share afterwards, Jules, is Atlassian has a My User Manual play, where it allows you as a person to put in kind of what your user manual is, how to work with you, and then to share that with the team. So I know that we found, in addition to writing down the team norms, hey, this is how Nikki works, or this is how Andrew works. And it really allows the team to function productively and efficiently.
Yeah, Nikki, that's a great idea. We didn't go that far with it. And I think, honestly, that's something I'll add to our template going forward. At this point, I think a lot of the folks have been working together for 9 months and they've gotten a sense of it. They developed it naturally. But for new folks coming on board, and I know that's your focus is onboarding. To me, that's where I think we could get new members on board probably more quickly and get them up to speed. In government, we often have people detail in and detail out. Sometimes by the time they're finding their working stride, it's time for them to go. So I think that's a great idea, honestly. I think that's something I'll add to our template. Folks, we'll throw that one out there as well. Or feel free to get in touch with me for it. But I think using a template and then having someone who's really experienced at facilitating, putting those things together, and Nikki, to your point, having folks be able to contribute their own little stamp to it, I think are all keys to success in figuring out how to use these tools.
Yeah, and we'll make sure to have those templates available to everybody down below or off to the sides if you take a look at the download pods. So I love the idea of understanding how individuals work and adapting for individuals. I think it's this idea that we've talked about with regards to being intentional. And in the past, if you think about an in-person work environment, the office really dictated how work was going to be done, and individuals adapted to that. But when you work from home, each individual home office, right, needs to be accounted for. But I want to look at the team level specifically. So what happens when you have different teams who perform work in different ways? Is there for an agency a one size fits all in terms of a project management tool, say? Is there, would you expect one type of project management tool to support all different types of projects, or do you find that different teams need different tools? And then how do you get different teams to actually work together across their tooling? So who wants to kind of take the lead on that question?
I can jump in. Again, the kind of buried in the nature of your question is the answer is going to be different for everybody, right? I think that what we found is, yes, teams work differently, and sometimes certain tools just don't meet the requirements. What we have found for the most part, specifically with Trello and with Slack, is we have a default tool. This is kind of the entry point that we're going to start here and see if this is what works for you, and then give us a reason why you need something else. And we know with pretty good sense that some teams, yeah, they're going to need something like a Jira. Trello is just not going to cut it. But when you're going across, especially non-technical teams these days, who are using more and more of these tools, something like Trello that has an easy entry point, that's where you want to start. It's not a particularly steep learning curve. And then folks come to you and start saying, hey, I need this little more advanced feature. People who you probably wouldn't have expected 9 months ago are asking for some integrations and things that are a little more advanced. That's when you start reevaluating it. And it's fair to continuous improvement. You should always be reevaluating your tools and looking to see if there's, you're ready to kind of graduate maybe from a Trello to a Jira or to something else, depending on what it happens to be. But I think the short answer is, have a default that you're ready to start with. And then figure out around the edges, like what the other use cases are. Don't try to do a full analysis from scratch for each team that is going to work a little bit differently. And then the great news about some of these tools like Trello is they're adaptable to different teams. You can pull out different features and different, you can set up your own workflows and figure out for your given team what you need to use.
Now, Urvashi, your department took a decidedly different approach several years ago in thinking about the technology that your teams use. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then talk about how your teams, your individual teams, have made the decisions for themselves on their platforms and their technology evolutions, and what that has meant in the remote work environment?
Yeah, that's an excellent segue into, I think, how are we prepared for this pandemic goes back to the strategic investments that were made over the last 3 to 5 years. So the agency where I come from, we were fortunate to have a private sector person come in to actually kickstart our digital transformation. And the first thing they noticed was, are people equipped with the right tools to actually change or transform services? And so she went on a mission to actually equip employees with the tools and provide them with the right training. So we were, and that's what we call our ISET digital office, or its components. So we have digital lounge. We actually thought about how do we get executives and senior people actually using these tools, because tools are there, but if nobody uses them, they are not worth it. So we went on to Microsoft Office 365. So as we switched during the pandemic, we were exposed to Microsoft Teams, but we were not using them fully. So the moment we made that shift within a week, everybody was using Microsoft Teams. We were using Jira because we wanted to we have multidisciplinary teams working on projects. So if you're working on a digital transformation project, you have IT folks on your team, you have designers, you have user researchers, you have policy program teams. And I think we were already had very well adopted to Jira as the common tool. And we were using Slack and other forms, but now we are Microsoft Teams. So I think those investments were the ones I found that there was absolutely no drop in productivity. And because we were tasked with very pandemic related research, we did not waste even a day, and we were on doing interviews, and the transition was so smooth. When I look back, I don't think that was the case everywhere. And I think we were fortunate to be in a department where they were able to quickly accelerate the need for extra broadband to make sure all employees were connected. So 5,000 employees overnight going to virtual work was an amazing feat. And other departments followed. And I think that's really nice to see that it accelerated that adoption of these tools, which would have taken another 5 to 10 years for us to be where we are today. So it's been very fascinating.
And Andrew, from your point of view, taking a look at the GSA, and particularly the area of the GSA that you work in, I think is relatively equivalent to Urvashi's team in terms of your technology adoption. So clearly for the GSA, did you find that there was a similar ease to the pivot because there had been an early and upfront investment in the technology?
Yeah, I think we were probably a little behind where Urvashi's team was just by virtue of when everything went down last year. I think that, yeah, having a lot of those things in place really helped. We had, small teams. In our case, the CTO team was already using enterprise Trello. We had a team of, maybe 15 or so. When we scaled up to 400 during the course of the pandemic for our infrastructure team, yeah, because we already had a lot of those lessons learned and we had made some investment and basically a decision to start going that enterprise route, that really helped. So that was a great advantage that we had. Similarly on Slack, upgrading from to enterprise grid from just a few disparate instances was helpful. We figured out, relatively quickly that we could scale these things without too much additional investment because we already had some of the key things in place.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And then Nikki, I want to pivot just a little bit and I want to talk about transparency. So we've talked about the need for leaders to really sort of set the stage with their workers and their employees and really kind of balance out the employee well-being and make it, kind of prioritize it up there with employee productivity. But we've also talked a little bit about teams and what teams need. And I really kind of want to pivot to this area of transparency because I think it's been one of the most difficult in the remote work environment. So whether it's project and program reporting or just sharing your work in progress, in the past it was done in a pretty informal way, but all of a sudden when you think about what's available now with the technology, there becomes a lot more vulnerability in it. So how does Atlassian really kind of think about reporting out to peers as well as superiors in terms of work and work status?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I might answer it a couple of different ways. I'm going to start with the leadership piece and the transparency. If you expand the definition to also just include a little bit more of the empathy and the compassion. And what I mean by that is I think what we found where I'm assuming a lot of the government agencies did as well, people were working a lot more because now there's like a blurred line between this work-life balance. And so leaders really checking in and understanding where are people burning out? Like, how is their work-life balance happening? Do they have kids at home? What's their situation? Are they living in a small studio where they don't have the best working environment? So I think for us, it started with ensuring that our people were okay and supporting them and helping them as best as we could, whatever their specific situation was. And then I think once we kind of were able to help create that baseline and that safety, I think then we were really able to then focus on, hey, how are we pivoting and sharing information and making sure people are staying productive? And we define it as working open. And so what that means for us is sharing what you're doing, when you're doing it, how you're doing it, et cetera. And we obviously use our tools to do that, but that might look like a quick status update on Slack, right? Or an update through Confluence or an updated ticket in Jira. But the idea is how can you take what you were doing in the office and replicate it, not entirely, but adjust it for a virtual environment. And so, if Jules, you and I were sitting next to each other, I would just turn and ask you a question or give you a quick update or get your input on something. And so rather than it feeling punitive or having it feel like you had to send a status report, it's more of like, hey, how are you sharing this with your team, right? So I might now send you a quick Slack and say, hey, Jules, just want to let you know I finished X, Y, and Z thing. And so changing a little bit of the culture around it, or the perspective around it, I think has helped. And so that we've really been able to continue just being open and working open, similarly to how our offices were set up.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd also, add to it that these ideas of transparency and accountability go hand in hand, and the balance, towards more transparency, from accountability grows as teams get more experienced and develop to more of a norming stage of development. One of the things I often share with teams, who are just starting their Agile journeys, is that the great thing about transparency and accountability on an Agile teams is you're starting to flatten them, and it works both ways on the org chart. You're holding, your bosses accountable for, work done or not done. You can see exactly, what it is that, and the whole team can see, if they're holding you up on something. And that's one of the great things about these tools is you don't need those skip level meetings. You can kind of just immediately talk to your boss or boss's boss and see on the board exactly, where something is in progress. And the other side, one things we found is that people who are, maybe more shy in meetings and they're not the best maybe about bragging about their work or advocating for themselves, their work is there right on par on a Trello board with everyone else's. All of a sudden, people who aren't as excited to speak up in a meeting and share that that cool thing they did or saw are just dropping it into a Slack channel. So what I think is we're actually seeing the contributions of so many folks who are maybe getting lost in the past, and that's one of the great things that we're seeing coming out of this, at least at GSI.
Mhm.
Isn't that a little bit counter to government culture? And Urvashi, I'd love to hear from your perspective as well, because your team has really kind of led the charge in breaking down some of government culture, where there's a specific hierarchy, and there's limited need to know, and while the need to know doesn't apply across all of the programs, it's really kind of led this very specific way that information is dealt with.
Mhm. So I'm going to answer it two ways. First, myself, I'm actually a leader in government for having a very non-hierarchical approach to working. So I start with a very high level of trust in all my employees, and I don't manage their time. So I was not doing that before, and I was not managing work from that hierarchy perspective. What I was doing was I was holding people accountable for the outcomes, and input is all their choice when they want to work, how they want to work. That freedom was there. I think after pandemic with the virtual world, it is actually multiplied. But what I find interesting across the government is that other leaders have to now think back that that hierarchical model is not the model. So you do still hear instances where some teams pivoted to working virtually, but they were asking their employees to report at 9 in the morning and then at 5 in the evening. And I think there is a lot of learning to be done in the government context, that we need to trust our people. And if there's 1% of workforce that requires attention, find tools to manage them and not manage rest of them to get that 1% to perform. And I think we must reflect on what we are seeing. So suddenly we have been shifted into this place of where we have to trust everyone, we have to manage by outcome, and we should not go back to the way we were managing before. So yes, we do need to provide updates to our management, and we can be smart about it, and we don't have to follow template approach. And I think we as leaders and managers must break out of that cycle. So this is a message really for the leaders, because I find working level, they're so adaptable, they're so flexible, they want this way of working environment. And I hope moving forward, the leaders have that comfort, because nobody ever thought that deputies and the senior people could ever work from home. It was so much required to be in person in a big boardroom, everyone sitting around, and look at that model is gone out of the window. So let's see how we can continue with a hybrid approach, and we develop that trust, because 99% you can trust your people. I always say, let me manage the situation when somebody breaks that trust, and let's not punish others for that 1%.
I'd love to hear from each of you. And Nikki, I'd really like to start with you, a few strategies to combat employee fatigue and really cultivate morale for employees that are struggling and missing that face-to-face environment. So it's a little bit of what we've been talking about, I think, throughout the whole panel session, but what are some tips and insights that you might have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think Andrew, or she touched on this already, but I think leadership's a real key to that. And I think step one is understanding where people are at and what they need on a personal level. I think that's step one. We mentioned before of just checking in and seeing if people are burnt out, how's their well-being, right? Because it can differ across the board. As far as just keeping that connection, I think we've seen a lot of success by just creating some social engagement online, right? Whether that's a virtual happy hour. We've had teams that have come together to do sessions. They paint things together, right? Or there's different clubs that get together. But I think the idea is we've been trying to offer a variety of different things for people to get connected. And I know that can be difficult for different government agencies, but I think the idea is how it takes intentionality. You've heard me say it a couple of times, right? It's not as easy as just running into someone and asking them if they want to grab a coffee or seeing how they're doing. And so whatever that looks like, but I think the first step is really understanding what that individual person or that team, what they're missing, what they need in order to feel that social connection. And there's a variety of tools and applications, et cetera, that can help you do that, help you achieve that. But it's not a one size fits all. And so I think it's just really trying to understand the needs of the team.
Very cool. Andrew, from your point of view as well, when you think about how to combat employee fatigue and cultivate morale, what are some of the things that the GSA is doing?
Yeah, two things. One, just building on what Nikki said about intentionality. I think that's so important. And I'll take it a step further and apply it to something else she said about these virtual happy hours. They're great. These things are really great tools. That said, there's some people who are starting to suffer from virtual happy hour fatigue. It's just that the same idea of doing, okay, well, it's Friday, it's happy hour time. It can get to be a little bit monotonous. So one of the things that we've done is starting adding fun components. We've done this at my company and at GSA, but adding, very well-defined intentional components to them. And so it could be like we did a speed dating internally a few weeks ago, where we just started pairing people for 60 seconds to 90 seconds with people they don't typically work with, just to kind of get to know each other. We did an escape room, a virtual escape room, which was pretty fantastic. So just having these sort of things tied to those events is helpful. The other thing I'd say is that a theme of this has been leadership. One of the key things, and this will, I think, go over well with some and not so well with others, but allow your employees latitude to take breaks and have time. This 9 to 5 thing doesn't work for everyone right now, and maybe a lot of it didn't work for before, quite frankly. So, there are days when people are going to be more productive. There are days when they're going to be less productive. There are times when they're going to be more productive, and there are times when they're going to be less productive. Let them work that way. This constant check-in and things like that. I think we're doing a pretty good job of it. But this is a theme I think that should be carried forward, not just a temporary blip. So I hope that's something that continues. I hope that there's some leaders out there who haven't quite caught on to that yet, I think. But let your teams tell them when and how they want to work, and just leave them alone sometimes if they're having a bad day. That you can't fix every problem as a leader. Sometimes you just need to give it a little bit of time. So I think those are a couple of the key learnings we found. And that'll have a good impact on morale. I think we've actually maintained it pretty well so far, given the situation we find ourselves in this past year.
And I agree with all the things that Nikki and Andrew said. I think going back, the team morale really depends upon the clarity of the mandate of the work you are doing. So as a leader, if in these times of crisis, you can clarify what is it we are doing and how they are contributing, that actually goes a long way in terms of actually fighting even some of that fatigue. Yes, we need to really pay attention to what type of activities they can do. So that my message to everyone is help each other out, lean on your team members. So if you don't create that space where people are comfortable to say that they are having a bad day, you cannot manage it. So again, goes back to leadership. how do you create that space, safe space? And I'm happy to say the space I create wherever I work, I am included in every conversation. So nobody says, oh, we don't want management there because we won't be able to speak freely. So that's the power of leadership, that you be included in those conversations.
Thank you very much, Urvashi, and for all of our panelists today. As we've learned, the pivot to remote work is continually evolving. No matter where you are with your evolution, there always seems to be just a little bit more to do. We hope that this has been an informative session for you today, and I'd really like to thank all of our panelists for their time and their insight. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Urvashi. We've got a few of the tools and templates that we discussed shared below, and for Andrew, Urvashi, and Nikki, thank you all our audience members for your time during this session. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the Atlassian Government Symposium.